This is Dan Schneider. I'm back again with Mitchell Hadley for our discussions on American television. And this time we will be talking about the history and the future and the present of game shows. It's a subgenre that includes all kinds of things, but since we had discussed earlier in an earlier show, quiz shows, we'll only touch a bit on the quiz shows here, since that's in a sense almost a distinct thing. So welcome, Mitch. For those who have not seen you before, can you give a little précis on who you are?
Sure. Thanks very much, Dan. Welcome. Happy New Year to everybody out there. And I am a classic TV historian and writer. I have a website, itsabouttv.com, where I write about classic television from the 50s through the early 80s and beyond, and what it tells us about American history and American pop culture. And with that, I think I'd like to buy a vowel.
So, like many things, game shows evolved on radio, similar to soap operas, say, and also variety shows. When did radio first dabble its toes into the game show market, if you will?
Well, remarkably enough, the first game show or quiz show on radio goes all the way back to 1923. And it was on WNYC in New York, and it was called the Brooklyn Eagle Quiz on Current Events, named after the newspaper. And it was a very basic format. They had high school students who came on to answer questions. The host, notably, was H.V. Kaltenborn, who would go on to become a very well-known newscaster and commentator on radio. But at this point in time, it was strictly a local show. And although it's not very well known today, and in fact we don't know how well known it was even back then because it was only broadcast in New York, but there are references in print to it as late as 1941, which would give it a 17-year run, and that would be pretty good for just about any show, radio or TV. That was the beginning, though. Then to go about a decade further to the mid-1930s, the first national quiz show on radio was called Professor Quiz, and that debuted on CBS in September of 1936. And a week later, NBC, which was the other major radio network at the time, followed through with their own version, which was called Uncle Jim's Question Bee. And those were very similar shows. Both cases, what they'd have are a group of contestants who would stand up on stage and they would be asked various questions, just like a spelling bee might be today, and they would eliminate contestants one by one until they got to a winner. That was the beginning of the quiz shows, the game shows on radio. Some of the most famous ones would follow then. NBC's follow-up was called Information Please, and that was hosted by Clifton Fadiman. That's one of the most famous, I think, of the radio quiz shows, not only because of its panel, because it would have a very erudite panel of celebrities, authors, journalists, artists, guests like Orson Welles or Basil Rathbone. So it was a very dignified panel, and it was the panel, not any participants from outside, the panel who would be trying to answer the questions and show their breadth of intelligence. So that captured the public imagination, but it also became a standard part of American culture, because what came out of that in the early 50s was the Information Please World Almanac. That was the origin of that name, and that almanac stuck around in various formats until 2013, when the internet really began to serve as a world almanac online. But Information Please was a standard part of entertainment at that point in time, and it was something that people were very familiar with. There was another show called Quiz Kids, which was kind of a juvenile version of Information Please, where you had the same format, you had the same smart, intelligent panelists, only in this case they were kids. And they were showing off their knowledge, becoming kind of niche celebrities in the process. But there was the genesis of the quiz show, the game show, starting in radio. Now, its evolution to television, we shouldn't be surprised, came along fairly quickly, as it did with so many of these other formats. In fact, the first day of real commercial broadcasting, which was in September of 1941, that was the date when, or the time when the experimental stations were given the go-ahead by the federal government to start what we might consider the regular commercial broadcasting to the public, rather than just doing it on an experimental basis. And we shouldn't be surprised to find that on that very first day of broadcasting, two of the shows that they had on their schedule were special TV versions of radio quiz shows. The first one was Question B, which we've heard about previously. The second was another successful radio quiz show that would become far more famous for obvious reasons when it moved to television. It was called Truth or Consequences. And it was created by Ralph Edwards, the same man who would go on to do This Is Your Life. And Truth or Consequences involved a variety of stunts that people would have to perform. And if they didn't successfully perform the challenge, then they would have to pay the consequences. For example, they would have to dress up in a diaper and cry, or they would have to sit on someone's lap. They would have to do something outrageous. And it didn't take Edwards long to realize, in fact, I think he instinctively could see it from the very beginning, that this was a format that was going to be much more powerful and popular if it appeared on television, where people could actually see the people being put through these consequences, the little devil horns, than it was on radio. But these were both one-off specials for the time, but Truth or Consequences in particular became a very popular game show when it did find a regular spot on television. And from there on in, the format grew and grew. You had shows like You Bet Your Life, which was the Groucho Marx game show. It was really an interview show and an opportunity for Groucho to crack jokes at the expense of or in conjunction with his own contestants. But you had shows like that would come over from radio. And then you had an entirely different school of shows that were original to television, that or that took a radio idea and expanded on it. And just as an example of that latter part, I would point out a radio show called The $64 Question, which morphed to TV, but $64 wasn't enough, and that became the $64,000 question. That was big enough to be on TV. And you take a show like that, and that takes us into the quiz show scandals, which we have talked about, but that shows the evolution of how quiz shows came from radio to TV. And they found two distinct places to go on TV: the big money primetime shows and the lesser money, perhaps more entertaining in a way, daytime shows.
Well, we'll talk about the daytime, nighttime split in a moment. I wanted to talk, because you mentioned the early shows where you had students. They were more leaning toward what became quiz shows. I remember there was something called like the College Bowl or something, where you would get kids from Purdue, kids from UCLA, and kids from Notre Dame, and they would be three teams representing their colleges. And these were this was, which Greek philosopher came up with the idea of blah blah blah. It wasn't just celebrity gossip stuff. But it seems to me, I having been born in '65, by the early to mid '70s, those shows sort of went away. What happened to them?
Yeah, I'll talk about College Bowl specifically because that is a great example. College Bowl did originate on the radio. I think most people would probably be more familiar with it when it came over to television, and it had a pretty good run on television. I think it was from 1959 to 1970, and it was hosted first by Alan Ludden, who later gave it up to go full-time on Password. And after Ludden left, it was Robert Earl who became the host of College Bowl. It was a very popular show. As you say, it was very challenging because the questions were not questions that the average home viewer might be expected to know. And so, therefore, it was a source of great pride for any person watching the show when they actually got a question right. I think that my wife and I both can remember in the last years of College Bowl that it was kind of exciting when you'd get one right because they not only were complicated, but it would be involving math, algebra, ancient history, and you had to be very quick on the button to answer the questions. But in the case of College Bowl, it's very interesting because its demise is directly related to the shape of American culture at the time. By 1970, the campuses were in an uproar, hotbed of radical thought and rioting, and you'd seen the takeovers in the late 60s of some campuses, at Columbia, for example. And General Electric, which had been the sponsor of College Bowl all these years, decided they didn't want to be associated with this anymore, that being involved with colleges was actually kind of a black mark for them. Now, you can contrast that with college football, which was in its heyday in the late 60s and early 70s, and in fact only got bigger after that. And if you were to ask me what the difference was, I couldn't tell you for sure, but I would hypothesize that the students that appeared on College Bowl, the intellectuals, the very smart kids, were probably the ones who would be more closely identified with the turmoil on campuses than the big jocks who were out there playing football and probably weren't going to classes at all, or if they were, they weren't involved in the activity on there. So that would be my guess as to why a show like College Bowl became a liability for GE, whereas college athletics wasn't. But that's only a guess. But anyway.
Well, I think the jocks had classes sort of like Home Ec 101, how to use a vacuum cleaner.
Yes, and as I recall, there was actually one school that had a class called the Doctrine of Football, where you could actually get a bachelor's degree in the Doctrine of Football.
A PhD in the forward pass.
Yes, exactly. I'd have so many diplomas on the wall just from sitting and watching the games that would be impressive nowadays. But there was a general downturn in game shows as a whole toward the end of the 60s, not just the intellectual ones, although you're right, those did seem to kind of evaporate. Now, I should say College Bowl continued on radio for a while, and in fact, it always was going on campuses. There were National College Bowl competitions that have continued to this day that aren't on TV or that have been brought back on TV, but it was just College Bowl on TV as we knew it that kind of disappeared. But more broadly speaking, there was a downturn in game shows, particularly at the end of the 60s. Now, on CBS, for example, the game shows were considered part of the Rural Purge. And you remember that during the Rural Purge, that's when CBS got rid of the shows like Petticoat Junction, Green Acres, the Beverly Hillbillies, Hee Haw, Red Skelton, because of the demographics. And they lumped in game shows along with the Rural Purge. And that's why they disappeared in the late 60s from CBS. they stayed on the other two networks, NBC and ABC, and in fact they continued to grow in popularity, and so CBS wound up getting back in the game. But CBS had a number of shows in that era. They had What's My Line, I've Got a Secret, To Tell the Truth. The latter two were standards on daytime TV along with Password. And those all went off the air at around the same time, both their daytime and their nighttime versions. What's My Line, which was probably the classiest show on television. We may talk about that later. That went off the primetime air in 1967. It had a 17-year run, 16 of those years in the same time slot, if you can believe that. But then it came back a year or so later in syndication, and that version was a 5-day-a-week show. So it aired in some places in prime time, most places in the daytime or just before prime time began. And so that took on the format of a daytime show, even though it might be showed in the evening. But that was, I think that you kind of look at that decrease in game shows. Part of it is connected to the quiz show scandal, because after that, game shows became primarily a daytime thing. They disappeared more or less completely from primetime, except for panel shows. That's a subset of game shows that we can get into. But they disappeared from primetime. They became a daytime show, and gradually they evolved from being celebrity-driven shows to contestant-driven shows, either with a celebrity partner or just as contestants.
Let me just throw this out. I think a large part of what happened to primetime game shows was in '73 they got rid of the 7:30 time slot, which used to be prime time, and in the East Coast, and made it just 8 to 11. So that 7:30 sort of intro to 8 p.m. shows was gone, and that was probably filled either with the network or affiliate stations that weren't network affiliate would fill it with game shows like Beat the Clock or things like that.
Well, what happened when the prime time access rule came along in the early 70s, and as you say, that took a half an hour of prime time broadcasting time that had been controlled by the networks, and it was given to local affiliates instead, in the hopes that what they would do is pursue it with public affairs and local interest broadcasting. Instead, invariably what happened is that half hour was taken over by syndicated programming, and the syndicated programming in many cases was game shows. Yeah. So you saw a revival of a show like The Price is Right, which had a long run in the 50s and 60s on daytime and primetime television. It had gone off the air. Then it was resuscitated in the early 1970s as The New Price is Right. And that had both a daytime and a nighttime component. The daytime version was hosted by Bob Barker, who had made his name hosting quiz shows with Truth or Consequences on TV. The nighttime version was hosted by Dennis James. And those game shows that came on in the primetime access period were shows like Beat the Clock, the new syndicated version of To Tell the Truth, the new syndicated version of What's My Line, I've Got a Secret. They were 5-day-a-week shows in some cases, daily shows in other cases, just 1 day a week. You had Name That Tune. You had Beat the Clock. You had shows that were, again, resuscitated, as it were, from their original runs in the 50s and early 60s on network TV, and they became very popular as syndicated shows, and that was part of the shift from network game shows to syndicated game shows. And I would say that the syndicated form of the game show is the dominant form today, in that most of the game shows you see are syndicated, either local stations or through something like Game Show Network or Buzzer, things that we'll get to later on. But what that primetime access rule did achieve was it shifted the production of game shows from a network basis to a locally syndicated basis. It also introduced some local game shows, by the way. You had an extremely popular show called Bowling for Dollars, which isn't really a game show as we think of it, but it was a show that allowed local people to participate, to come on the show and to bowl on a weekly basis for the opportunity to win money or prizes.
In New York City, when I was growing up, we had two versions of that. One was midget bowling, where people would get midgets in a harness, and they'd wear like motorcycle things, and they'd throw them down the alleys. Now you couldn't get away with it. I'm absolutely 100% serious. And then the other one was dwarf tossing. This was in the early 70s when I was 7. I remember coming home from Cub Scouts and, like, oh, we're going to watch either dwarf tossing or midget bowling. Now, but anyway, let's pause.
In New England, what we had was called candlepin bowling, and we didn't use midgets to bowl, but we had midget bowling pins. They were duck pins or candle pins. That was the bowling there. But I'm sorry to say that we never had midget bowling that I'm aware of. So.
Yeah. So, Mitch, you had mentioned several sort of like differences in game shows, both in format, daytime, nighttime. Let's talk about some of the differences here. Let's talk about the difference between first game shows that had the nighttime version that usually aired once a week versus the daytime counterparts. The most famous example I can think of, and the biggest difference, was the Pyramid Game Show, where in the daytimes back in the 70s you had the $10,000 pyramid, but it went up to $25,000 in the nighttime version that aired. Whether that was syndicated or not, I'm not certain. But what were the general differences between them?
Well, you're right, and just to touch for a moment, returning to the after effects of the quiz show scandal, one of the reasons that the quiz show rigging was so scandalous was because it involved huge amounts of money. And so when the government cracked down after the quiz show scandal and started regulation of this kind of programming, the only shows that were able to survive and move on were shows that offered low stakes in their prize money. What's My Line, for example, and I should say that What's My Line, To Tell the Truth, and I've Got a Secret were three of the most popular shows of that time. They were all produced by Goodson-Todman Productions. They were really the only production company to come out of the quiz show scandal era intact. Yeah. They had never gone in for big money shows. You know, the most money you could win on What's My Line was $50. Yeah. So those you had lower stakes to begin with when you were talking about daytime shows. But
we'll talk about them that company in a bit.
But when you're looking at the basic difference, I think, between the daytime shows and the nighttime shows, one of the differences is that with the daytime shows, you could continue on the show for a while until you retired as undefeated champion or you were defeated. And if you look like shows like Pyramid or Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune, another example, because that came along in the early 70s, those shows would run Monday through Friday. Password is another example. Those shows would run Monday through Friday, and a contestant, if they won, would continue to play on the show for a given length of time. So they might appear on the show 2, 3, maybe even 4 days in a row. The nighttime versions, when they started, were all many of them at least were one night a week. So you had a slightly different format that was involved because the participants, if they were going to win, did not have the opportunity to continue on the show for several days and roll up big amounts of money and or prizes. So the adjustment that you had to make in order for those shows to become successful and popular would be that the prize money or the prizes had to be bigger. There had to be more at stake. So instead of coming on Jeopardy and being able to stay on for 5 days in a row, you had to be able to win that big money in one show. So that lent to a slightly different format in that you had more money being given away. It also means that some of these shows had to make adjustments as to how the game was played because you wouldn't be able to continue a game in progress over to the next day. So you might have a bonus round. You might have something that would come up after the regular playing of the game that people would be able to take part in that would bring the show to a natural conclusion, that you'd have the big money giveaway at the end of the show, that was it, and then the next program everybody would start with a fresh slate.
Yeah, and I think in the 50s especially, the primetime shows were often done live.
Hmm. They were, and that ratcheted up the suspense because if you had somebody who was returning, you'd have to wait a whole week to find out what happened to them. And in addition, because the shows were live, the contestants had to wait a whole week to return. Now,
Mm.
whether we're talking about shows that are rigged or not is a moot point when you're talking about it from this perspective. The point is that these ordinary people would have to live through an entire week of uncertainty before they would return on the show the next week to continue their march toward the top. That was part of the popular appeal for the viewer, is knowing that the contestant would have to live through that week with all the attendant nerves. Would they go back to their regular jobs? What would they be doing for the week interval before they appeared on the show again? That changes when you go to a strip programming format where you're doing 5 shows a week. They're often being taped and they're being done 5 shows a day. So you're doing literally a month's worth of shows over the course of a week. And if somebody is appearing on the show 5 broadcasts in a row, they were probably all done that week. So they might try to suggest in the patter that goes on between the MC and the contestant that there was a rising suspense coming back day after day. But in reality, they were doing it all during the course of one day.
Yeah, after the quiz show scandals, the 1960s seemed to pivot a little bit away from shows that were based on the intellect, with the exception of something like the College Bowl. But those are mostly youngsters, kids.
Hmm.
What you got generally in the 1960s, as I recall, were you had shows that had a little bit of intellectual entertainment, but usually had celebrities, and they were fun shows.
Hmm.
You would have the Hollywood Squares, a later Match Game 73, which was a revival of a show in the 60s that totally changed format. It became the biggest show of the era.
Hmm.
But you also had shows that were like Beat the Clock, and other shows where people would get stuff dumped on. I think now you have like kids show they've had for 20 years or more goop dumped on them.
Yep.
And I would even say something like Survivor, some of these shows on the is it the CW that I've
Hmm.
seen on my breaks at work, where they get these handsome, studly guys and these gorgeous young girls, and they stick them on an island, and they go to tribal war. But they're basically something like Beat the Clock, because the winners get like $1 million to split or something.
Yeah.
So it is, in a sense, a game show, but it's an action-oriented one. But it seems, with the exception of things like the Survivors and shows like that, the Beat the Clock kind of shows are nowhere to be found.
Right. Yeah, I think as you come through the 60s and the 70s and even into the 80s, you could broadly separate game shows into 3 categories, maybe. The first category would be the game show that is primarily a comedy show. I would give the Hollywood Squares and Match Game as examples of that. Yes, you did have contestants on there, contestants who could win money and other prizes, but they were dependent on the answers that were given to them from the celebrities. And the celebrities were chosen not for their ability to answer questions like they might have on Information Please. They were based on their ability to be funny. And it was their also their ability to be able to sell the jokes that they were given as being spontaneous jokes that came from right off the top of their head. I think Hollywood Squares and Match Game are perfect examples of that. You didn't really tune in to watch the competition.
Yeah.
You wanted to see what Paul Lynde or Charles Nelson Riley or Brett Summers was going to say.
Yeah.
And they were hilarious. They were often slightly in bad taste. They were full of double entendres in the Match Game, particularly where they would do the 5-show-a-day type routine, and the celebrities were known to be imbibing between episodes. By the time you got to the Friday show, people were half tanked on there, and it was like the difference between the Golden Globes and the Oscars. They were extremely entertaining, but their source of entertainment was not really the competition. It was the comedy that was being generated by the celebrities. That was the sitcom type of game show.
And Match Game 2, it became, Richard Dawson was so good at giving the answers in the final matches that 95% of the time whoever was doing the final match would pick Dawson. And so they even at one point after 4 or 5 years instituted a wheel to spin for someone other than Richard Dawson. So it was like, is someone ever going to pick someone other than Richard Dawson? Became a part of that show's theme.
Yeah, and his nose got a little out of joint over that because he liked that reputation as being the man to go to. And the sidebar to that is that at that point in time, there was a production crew coming up with the idea for a game show that they called Family Feud. And they approached Bob Crane, who was the star of Hogan's Heroes, and they said, Bob, we've got this game show. We think you'd be a great host for this. Is it something you're interested in? And they talked to him about the format, what would be required, and he said, no, I don't really want to get into the game hosting business, but I'll tell you who I think would be good at that is Richard Dawson. I worked with him on Hogan's Heroes. He's on the Match Game. I think he'd make a great host for you on Family Feud, and the rest is history. So yes, Dawson was the outstanding intellectual, if you will, star on that show, and that parlayed into his own show. Yeah. Now, there was a second kind of game show that was on that was very big during the 60s and the early 70s. I would call that the quasi-reality show. And there are the two outstanding versions of that are the Dating Game and the Newlywed Game. They both came from the Chuck Barris stable. Yeah. And Chuck would go on to do the Gong Show after that. But his first big hits on TV were the Newlywed Show and the Dating Game. And again, the appeal of those shows is not the competition. What it is, because I don't know if anybody really cared who won the Newlywed Game, but it was the answers, the questions and the answers, and the way ordinary people would answer them. And in the case of the Newlywed Game, you had 4 married couples who were quote unquote newlyweds. They had usually been married less than a year.
Was it 4? I thought it was 3.
I think it was 4 because the set would split in half when Bob Eubanks would come on. And there were 2 on each side. Okay. And the questions that they were asked were always loaded. Yeah. And the questions often took advantage of couples who were perhaps not as well educated as people might be. I'm trying to be delicate in the way I phrase that, because a lot of the humor that would come in would be in the result of answers being given to what contestants thought the question was rather than what they actually were being asked. And it was particularly funny if one of the spouses knew what the question meant and the other one didn't. Then you get hilarity ensues. Somebody gets whacked over the head with a card that has the answer to the question on it. Again, this is a very primitive form of reality programming, and I think the same goes with the dating game, where you had these questions that were being asked of participants that were just on this side of sexually explicit questions. But they were the same kinds of elements that you see on reality shows today, accidents waiting to happen. So I would call those the reality show type of game shows.
Well, I remember on the Newlywed Game, you'd get a question like, has your husband ever come home too tired from work to make whoopee? And the wife would say,
great euphemism, yes.
And then, but the husband would say, "Oh, I've never been." And then he'd get the card for it, and then didn't only have that, but you'd have the musical cue that would be like, "Boom, boom, boom," just like a deflating penis or something. Now let's, since we mentioned Chuck Barris and some of these other people, let's just take a little sidebar here and talk about the celebrity. The celebritization of the game show hosts. We mentioned people that Alan Ludden on Password, Bert Convy was on Tattletales and a few other shows. I think he followed up a Password too. Gene Rayburn on Match Game, and he was also on to Tell the Truth, often as a contestant. Gary Moore from the 50s on. Peter Marshall became famous with Hollywood Squares. Bob Eubanks with the Newlyweds. Dennis James, you mentioned. And I think Dennis James might have been involved. Was he involved in the quiz show scandal at one point?
If he was, it was only tangentially. The hosts of those games, for the most part, were exonerated from being involved in them.
And then Bob Barker, of course, had a 50-year run on The Price is Right. Alex Trebek, 40 years, and then before that, he spent 10, 15 years doing stuff. And then Richard Dawson, as you mentioned. So these guys almost became sort of like sex symbols. The two in particular, Richard Dawson was always kissing everyone on the lips. And Bert Convy sort of became the Burt Reynolds of daytime television. He was like because he was a mediocre B actor himself, but he became sort of this hunky host that everyone on a show like Tattletales, another show that was based on titillation, so talk to me about some of these guys and
I think that any conversation about game show hosts, probably the man I would want to start off with is Bill Cullen, who was the original host of The Price is Right, and he was a host or a participant on dozens of different game shows because he was brilliant at it, whether he was the player on the panel or the host himself. If you listen to game show hosts from the time talk about their colleagues in the business, invariably, almost to a man, when they're asked to name the game show host's host, it's Bill Cullen. He was the most highly respected and admired of all the hosts because he had a very, well, hosts in general have a very difficult job. They have to govern the play of the game. They have to make sure things don't get out of hand. But at the same time, they have to be able to approach the contestants in a friendly, welcoming manner, to put them at ease, because the contestants themselves won't be any good if they're uptight or if they're not game to go on there. And Cullen had that way. He had a warm, inviting, relaxing character that put people at ease. And there are even stories about how he would put other celebrities at ease. Cullen had suffered from polio as a child, and it left him with a limp that resulted mostly in him opening a show already seated. He didn't talk about it. It was no big deal, and it never hampered his performance. But Mel Brooks talks about a time when he was appearing as one of the celebrity contestants on a show, and he inadvertently made a joke between tapings about the way Cullen walked, only realizing after he had told the joke, what the implication of that was. And I think one of the other panelists whispered to him, "My God, Mel, Bill's had polio." And Brooks was absolutely beside himself with what he had done, and it was so profusely apologetic to Cullen. And Cullen puts his arm around him, and in essence what he says is, "Mel, I don't want you to think about it. I appreciate that you did that because I don't want people to be afraid to make jokes around me." And so Cullen had this marvelous ability to be able to do that, to turn things around and put people at ease. And I think for that and his jocularity, I think he's well deserved to be at the top of the frame. But you had other hosts, many of the ones that you've mentioned, that Bob Barker became a late in the day sex symbol for people, especially when he let his hair go silver, when he stopped dyeing it, and all of a sudden he was this great sex symbol for older women. You had, as you mentioned, people like Richard Dawson, who the network was very uncomfortable about him kissing all the female contestants. Their insurance company was very uncomfortable about it too, and he had to put them all at ease that he wasn't forcing himself on women, that they invited it, they wanted him to do it, and they were finally okay with that. But one of the keys, I think, to a successful game show is to turn it into that association with the host. As we said, Alan Ludden was Password. Pat Sajak was Wheel of Fortune. How many people remember that Chuck Woolery was the original host of Wheel of Fortune when it started in daytime? Not a lot of people remember that, but because he was very good on there. But when Pat Sajak took over, all of a sudden he is instantly identifiable in the role. Alex Trebek taking over Jeopardy! The original host of Jeopardy! Was Art Fleming when the show was a network broadcast, and Art Fleming was very popular as well. When Weird Al did his parody, "I Lost on Jeopardy!", he managed to get both Art Fleming and Don Pardo to resurrect their roles for the video version of that song. So true Jeopardy! Fans know who Art Fleming is. But one of the gifts that Alex Trebek had in hosting Jeopardy! And I got to see him in person as himself at the Minnesota State Fair many years ago. And this, I think, is part of the key to his personality. He was appearing at the State Fair not as the host of a show, but as a guest on a morning show there, a local morning show for the station that ran Jeopardy! In syndication. And he came on there and did his bit on there. And when the camera was off for the commercial breaks and he was asking, so he said, "Do you want me to stick around for a while? I can sign some autographs. Is that what you wanted me to do or something? Because I'd love to sit here and sign some." And so he was signing for people long after he was off the camera. And when they ran out of photographs, he offered to stick around until they got some more. So he was a completely open and engaging gentleman on there, but he also was able to give you on the show the sense that he knew the answers, or rather he knew the questions on Jeopardy! That he was smart enough to deserve to be the host of Jeopardy! I'll put it that way. And I think he was very smart. But let's take someone like Soupy Sales. Soupy Sales is a great comedian, but he is never going to convince anybody as host of Jeopardy! Trebek was able to do that, and he was able to do it for a long, long time. And personally, I think that there were only two other hosts who probably could have handled Jeopardy! And made it the big show it was. One of them would have been Bill Cullen. And I think the other one was Dick Clark, who did a very good job hosting the Pyramid in all of its different permutations. He spoke with authority. He was witty. He was a familiar face, and he was able to pull the best out of both the celebrity participants and the contestants. So yeah, you've got that cult of personality that surrounds the host. Tom Kennedy on You Don't Say is
Yeah.
another example. That they were it's a very specialized skill, and not everybody can do it and do it well.
Yeah, I think looking at Ken Jennings and the Mayim Bialik who did it,
Hmm.
they're okay, but I mean, they would not if the show had not become a phenomenon. I don't think they would have made it one. And just as a note before we take a break here, my wife is a distant cousin of Pat Sajak.
Oh, really?
She's like a third cousin once removed or something. So anyway, let's turn to some of the production companies. Probably the one that we mentioned earlier, Goodson-Todman, was it Mark Goodson and Bill Todman, was it?
Yep.
They had about a 30-year run before I think Goodman died, and then it just became Mark. No, Todman died,
Yes,
and it was just
Mark
it was
Goodson
just
was,
Goodson
yeah.
was left. So let's talk a quick sort of 30-year, 35-year overview of their shows and how they reacted to the different eras.
They had a formula that was very basic and very successful. And again, what I'll do is concentrate on their three main shows. I've Got a Secret, To Tell the Truth, and What's My Line? And incidentally, these are the shows that formed that third kind of game show that I was talking about earlier, which is the panel show. Their formula was that you brought in witty, intelligent, recognizable celebrities to form a panel. You had a host who was also witty and could keep up with what was going on and interacted well with contestants. And then you had contestants that interacted with the celebrities. So in the case of What's My Line, for example, which is my favorite of all of the shows of this kind, and I think it's probably, as I said, the classiest show that was ever on television of this type. You had the four celebrities making up a panel, and you would have someone come on the show, and they would try to guess this person's occupation based only on questions that could be answered either yes or no. No, no other explanation was necessary, although people would often offer additional information. You had the four panelists, the most famous of which, you had Dorothy Kilgallen, the Broadway columnist. You had Arlene Francis, the actress and TV personality. You had Bennett Cerf, who was the publisher of Random House. And then you had a fourth chair that was usually rotated amongst different guests, and it would be anyone from Martin Gable, who was Arlene's husband, and who was a well-known Broadway and movie actor on his own right, to people like John Lindsay or Kirk Douglas or Peter Falk or anybody like that. Steve Allen was a panelist for a time. Ernie Kovacs was on there. Fred Allen was on there until he died. And you had as a host John Charles Daly, who was, while he was hosting What's My Line on CBS, he was also the vice president in charge of news and public affairs for ABC. And he was chosen to host What's My Line by the sponsor because, as people will remember from our discussions about shows in the 50s, sponsors controlled much of the content on the air. And the sponsor pretty much had final say over a lot of the details of a program. So the sponsors wanted Daly as the host of What's My Line, regardless of the fact that he would be appearing on two different networks simultaneously. And Daly brought a lot of credibility as a newsman to the show, but he was also avuncular. He was charming. He was always he was always on the side of the contestant, and that's an important distinction to make. Of all of these shows, John Daly was perhaps the least neutral of all of the hosts. He was very clear from the very beginning of What's My Line that as the host, his job was to help the contestants stump the panel and win the most money. So he was always making it very hard for the contestants. He would force them into verbal gymnastics in such a way that he would try to induce a no answer out of the contestant, and he was always giving the contestants the benefit of the doubt. It was great fun to watch, but that is the prototypical blueprint for a Goodson-Todman show. You move over to a show like I've Got a Secret, same situation. You have 4 panelists. You have the host, Gary Moore, who is then replaced by Steve Allen, and you have a normal contestant who is going to come on with some kind of a secret that the panel has to ascertain through asking questions. And you had an amazing number of people on that show. I remember one of the guests on I've Got a Secret. His secret was, I saw John Wilkes Booth shoot Abraham Lincoln in 1865.
Yeah,
Incredible.
I remember that one.
And you had another one where the guests were, the secret was, the guests were Neil Armstrong's mother and father, and their secret was, our son was made an astronaut today. And it's one of the most famous instances on the show, because at the end of their segment, Gary Moore says, now I know this is a long way off and everything, but have you ever supposed, what would you say if your son became the first man to walk on the moon? With no indication that this was going to happen, but it's one of the great moments, I think, in television history as far as something like that.
And it was about 5 or 6 years before he actually did.
It was before Armstrong had flown in space at all. He had just been made an astronaut that day, so it's really remarkable. And I think here is something that is important in talking about the role of the host. When Gary Moore left I've Got a Secret, he was replaced as the host by Steve Allen, and it changed the dynamics of the show, and it did not change it for the better, although Allen was a lot of fun to watch. One of the problems he had, and Henry Morgan, who is a longtime radio and television celebrity himself, Henry Morgan explained it the best, that he said when Gary Moore was the host, he was there to compliment us and to set it up. Steve Allen was fine, but it felt like he was competing with us to be funnier than we were. That shows you how difficult the host's job is. The final show in that was another one. It was called To Tell the Truth. And that was the one that, when the pilot was made, it was called Nothing But the Truth, and Mike Wallace was the host. But when it became To Tell the Truth, it followed a very similar format. You had, again, 4 panelists, the most famous of which was probably Kitty Carlisle, and you had 3 contestants who would come on there, each one of them claiming to be a particular person. One of them was that person. The other 2 were trying to stump the panel. And so after questioning all 3 of these people, they would have to guess who the actual real person was, as opposed to the imposters. And there was incentive for the real person to brief his imposters very well, because the more celebrities that were stumped, the more money was won, and the 3 of them would split that money up. So the more money that they could get out of the panel, the more that they would take home. And so they all were very similar in content, but they all followed the host of To Tell the Truth.
The original one.
He was, he was also played the voice of Superman in the animated Superman adventures, and I can find that in just a second. I could almost replay it in my mind and hear Johnny Olson identifying him. Bud Collyer.
That's right.
Bud Collyer was and Bud Collyer filled again the same role as all of these other genial, friendly hosts did, who could keep the show going.
Now, I've said before, I was born in '65, and I remember Collier left, I think, when the primetime show ended. A year or two
Yes.
later, the syndicated version came on. They had another interim host for a couple of years, but then in 1972, I think it was, Gary Moore took over to tell the
Yes.
truth, and that was
Yes, he
that was
did.
when they had the ba 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 da da da
And they
da
had the
da
big
da.
figure there.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
And I thought, I'm trying not to do the good old days thing, but I think that was the best version of To Tell the Truth, because Gary Moore was a better host, I think, than Bud Collyer.
And he had very familiar people on
Right. It was
the
Colin
panel.
Carlisle and Peggy Cass.
Hmm.
But I think the thing that made that is something that also, in retrospect, made the dating game very special. The dating game had a lot of future celebrities. Match Game had a lot of people who were future celebrities there. I just saw one the other day. I've been watching them on and off a few weeks. Doug Henning, the magician, made his first national television debut there. People like that, who aren't necessarily superstars. But another thing that really I thought about that show, which was so good, was it's a sort of cultural time capsule, because you would have people come on. I've just written a book. You'd get people who wrote books like Jonathan Livingston Seagull, but not as popular as that book. One woman came on and wrote, I wanted to swap my life, and she wrote a book about 10 days she spent having swapped her family and whatnot. And these are very 1970s things. And if you're doing research, like I often do if I'm doing my writing, and I want to know something, I watch some of these old shows, and they'll mention celebrities I've forgotten. And I'm like, oh, you drop them in as cultural reference points. And I think that's one of the things why
Yep.
game shows, and we'll segue in a few minutes over to Game Show Network and Buzzer. I think that's one of the reasons game shows, despite obviously being set, in the 1960s, if they have a buzz cut, they become something that it's like watching old family movies.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think What's My Line was the best at that, because not only did you have the mystery guests, the celebrities who could give you the idea of what pop culture was like, but you had ordinary people, as you pointed out, many of whom were doing things that would become better known. There were several ordinary people on What's My Line who became celebrities. I think the syndicated version of What's My Line had a mystery guest in, I think it must have been 1973 or 74, who got a lot of mileage out of his appearance. He was the mystery guest. I don't know that the panel was even masked for him. They were so sure that they wouldn't recognize him. He came on there and he wrote his name on the blackboard, and they showed his what his line was on the screen, and it said, "I am governor of Georgia," and his name was Jimmy Carter. And nobody knew who he stumped the panel, and less than 4 years later, he's president of the United States.
Yeah.
But you're right, you could have somebody like Herman Tonauer on there. I just wrote a diet book, Scarsdale Diet. And I believe they had the inventor of the Heimlich maneuver on there. They had
Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris
Yeah.
made his first television appearance,
And
and it was funny because I just saw the show. A little kid about 5 years old flipping Chuck Norris around, and obviously Chuck Norris is aiding him. But you know who that little kid turned out to be? Land of the Lost, Chaka, the little Philip Paley, the guy who played the littlest of the little ape men, and Chuck Norris both made their debuts karateing each other.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And Seiji Ozawa, the famous symphony conductor, was a mystery guest on What's My Line before anybody had really knew anything about him. So you hit it absolutely on the button. These are time capsules. These are family albums. That's our history in these shows as much as anything that you want to say on TV.
So let's just talk a bit about the rise of game show networks and the repeats here, because by the 1980s, game shows had really started to peter out. The 1970s was sort of like, I mean, I don't know if there's a direct correlation between game shows and soap operas, but they had their ups and downs similarly. And it seems to me that by the 1980s, Match Game had run its course.
Hmm.
Hollywood Squares had come and gone after a 12, 15-year run. And then basically we had the twin rise of Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy's
Yep.
revival in early evening. You had Price is Right in the morning. But so many shows just started falling by the wayside. I think it's the early 90s when Game Show Network starts up. So talk a little bit about what caused this sort of dip in the 80s to the
Hmm.
90s and what prompted Game Show Network.
Well, I think that it's hard to identify whether the game shows dipped or whether they were simply replaced by a more attractive form of broadcasting. You're right in saying that the game shows and the soap operas kind of faded out at the same time, with some notable exceptions. But if you look at the shows that wind up taking their place, you've got talk shows, starting out with the Regis and Kathy Lee type of show, and then all the imitators that spawned. You have an expansion of local news programs, and I want to use the word news guardedly because they're not really news programs, they're not entertainment programs, but they're local. They're extensions of the local news that get more into features and soft things. And you have reruns as the syndication market becomes bigger and bigger. You have a change where networks are now allowed to have a more active financial interest in the syndicating of their old programs. They didn't used to have that, but in other words, you'd have to go through perhaps another distributor. The network wouldn't be able to have ownership in the shows that were being syndicated. That's a separate issue, but the relevance of it is that by the time we're getting to now the 90s, those rules have changed. And because television networks are able to syndicate their own owned programming, you're flooded with reruns of shows of any kind, anything from Friends to Home Improvement to Seinfeld to mostly, they would appear perhaps in the higher visibility times, but you had all kinds of shows that were winding up in the afternoon and early evening time slots. So between the talk shows and some of the early reality programming, the judge shows like The People's Court, and the expanded local programming and the expansion of syndication shows, they really muscled game shows out. And so when you look at the daytime, you're right. CBS has The Price is Right, which is never going off the air, and that was it. NBC phased out the daytime version of Wheel of Fortune, but it continued in the evening with Jeopardy. And until you had Let's Make a Deal revived by CBS, you really didn't have much more during the daytime.
Yeah.
So you have Game Show Network, and this is, I think, 1994 when GSN starts. And the beginning of Game Show Network is very interesting because obviously it's riding in on the crop of niche cable TV networks, and at that time you had a lot of them. You had A&E, which was mostly arts programming. You had Bravo, which was art house movies. You had HGTV, which wasn't just about home improvement, but it was about gardening and different things like that. You had what I would call the golden age of niche programming on cable, and one of those boutique networks was GSN. And what GSN did immediately out of the gate, they bought the Barry Enright catalog. So you're talking about shows like The Joker's Wild, and they got the Mark Goodson library, which had Password and What's My Line, and all these shows that would appear. They had an amazing treasure trove of shows. And that led in turn to a huge revival of interest in these old programs, because I got into watching What's My Line myself around that time, because I got the quick story. I got a phone call in the middle of the night. It was the wrong number. I hung up. Woke me up 2 a.m. The person called back. They were sure they had the right number, and I was covering up for somebody that didn't want to talk to the other party. Hung up. Called back again, 3rd time. Finally, I unplugged the phone. But at this point, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm not getting back to sleep. I have to go out and turn on the television. I turned on the TV, surfed around, ran into something that was in black and white. It was Password. It was followed by What's My Line. I became a devoted viewer of these reruns from then on. I went to the internet, to the message boards. They were filled with interest in these shows. All of a sudden, there was this huge revival of interest in them. And the measurement of that was that there is a book about What's My Line. The definitive What's My Line history was written by the producer of What's My Line, Gil Fates. It's out of print. It is available online if you look for it. And at the height of this interest in What's My Line, you would go on eBay and you could find that book available for $150 a copy. I got my copy at a library rummage sale for $2 because they didn't know what they had. But all of the interest in these old shows was immense. And so Game Show Network built around these 2 libraries, the Barry Enright and the Goodson-Todman library, and they included reruns of some more recent game shows that had been on, shows like Family Feud or Price is Right. And I may not be getting all of those names right, but Hollywood Squares, shows like that were 20, 30 years old, and found out that there was a huge market for these old game shows. And that was what started out Game Show Network. Now, that network originally was devoted to reruns, but gradually they begin to start producing their own game shows and augmenting the old programs with new programs. And they did their own revival of a show like To Tell the Truth or Hollywood Squares that they produced themselves and had their own celebrities on them. And this continues to transform to the point where by 2017 or so, almost everything on Game Show Network is original programming. They don't show any reruns anymore. And if they do show reruns at all, it's of their own shows. Now, they wind up so successful at being able to produce their own shows and finding a market for them. They even had a show, I think it was called Baffle. And that's one of the first ones that I remember that they had on during the daytime, which almost nobody remembers, but it caught on again with a new audience. This proved so successful that they started a sister station. It was called Game Show Central. And it was a streaming channel. And what this did was show archived versions of Game Show Network's original programming. So now Game Show Network, or GSN, they've gone back and forth on that, but they are doing all their own original programming, and they're putting the reruns of that original programming on another one called Game Show Central. Now that in turn led to yet another classic game show streaming service called Buzzer. Now, Buzzer took the spot that was formerly held by Game Show Network. Buzzer entered into deals to get those old shows, Password and What's My Line and those shows, and they became the exclusive home of the old shows, but they started to add on more of those shows. The Price is Right, particularly the episodes with Bob Barker. And they went to the next level. I would say they became the contemporary version of what television is involved into with streaming. They entered into a deal with Pluto, and they created dedicated channels devoted to one show. So Buzzer, for example, has The Price is Right, the Bob Barker Years channel on Pluto. Turn on to it, nothing but Bob Barker. And they've done that with some other game shows as well. Not, unfortunately, What's My Line, but some of the more contemporary, the more familiar shows, they have dedicated channels to them, and they've done very well with that, because if in some future show we talk about streaming, this will be one of the core parts of it, is called the FAST, free advertised supported television, where you don't pay for anything. You don't pay for Pluto, you don't pay for Roku, you only pay for the delivery device. Yeah. But those consist of mostly programming that's supported by commercials. And they've become enormously popular over the last year or two, because people in part are pushing back against having to pay more and more for the streaming networks that originally were supposed to be commercial free and now aren't. And so they have become very popular. And Buzzer is taking full advantage of that by having these dedicated channels like The Price is Right on Pluto. So they've understood what the next generation of television is, and they've kind of run with that to their success.
So, Mitch, the 21st century comes around. The late 1990s saw a brief juggernaut with I Want to Be a Millionaire. Well, how to Be a Millionaire. What it was.
Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
Yeah. And, to me, I saw a few episodes of it, and it was just a very generic game show, I thought. But in the 21st century, two hosting superstars emerged. One was Bob Barker's replacement, Drew Carey, who came after a successful comedic run, 6 or 7 years, whatever his show ran. And then the guy who really is game shows today, Steve Harvey. And I mentioned this before we started the show. An interesting cultural phenomenon, I think, has emerged in that game shows, and I'll bet you if you could look at the demographics, the Game Show Network, Buzzer, everything you just talked about, I bet you there are 3 or 4 times higher amounts, percentage-wise, of black viewers, especially, of game shows than there are in the general public, and maybe even some Latinos too, because you look at Steve Harvey, or Michael Strahan has hosted the ABC version of summer versions of Pyramid, that revivals.
Yep.
And there are a couple of other shows, but Steve Harvey, he is the man right now.
He is.
He's when we think of Family Feud, for 40 years it was Richard Dawson. Now Steve Harvey might be host number 1 of Family Feud, and it is even more raunchy in some ways than Dawson's show was in the day. So let me ask you, what do you think has precipitated this rise of the black viewership in game shows, and Steve Harvey in particular? I remember he had a show. I think he had a comedy show, but I mean he's far more well known now as a game show host.
Yeah, Steve Harvey, from all accounts, I've read a lot about how Steve Harvey can be a very difficult man to work with behind the scenes. And of course, he had that famous incident, was it on Miss Universe, when he announced the wrong winner when he was hosting the show. So Steve Harvey, on the face of it, doesn't seem to fit into what we had talked about before about some of the characteristics that make a successful game show host, except he does have it in front of the camera. And you're right, he's become not just, I would say he's almost Mr. Daytime TV when it comes to all of this. And I can only guess a couple of things. I'm sure that these networks are not stupid. They're looking at their demographics, and they are they're looking at particular audiences that are being attracted to these shows, and they're putting on programming that appeals to those audiences. Now, we could say that we live in a much cruder, raunchier culture now than we used to, and that these shows are a reflection of that. We could say that it is the product of a particular type of niche programming that appeals to the same kind of an audience that, let's say, the CW or before that UPN appealed to, which was a very young urban audience, and that these audiences are hip to this kind of programming. Um, we can say that this is either good or bad. We can lament it, or we can say that it's an accurate reflection of how things are. But for whatever reason, I would say that the syndicators and the producers of these shows have absolutely put their finger on the pulse of what their audiences want to see. And so it becomes a chicken and egg type of thing, which is something that any of us who are involved in the history business, looking at the history of television, look back, and one of the key questions is, does television influence culture, or is it influenced by it? And this is a perfect case of that. Are these shows reflecting culture, or are they shaping culture? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do think that they are reflecting it to the extent that they have their fingers on the pulse of what their audiences want. Whether they have created that demand or are merely responding to that demand is another question. But you're right that this is the shape of the game show right now. And when you look at who is it that's hosting Let's Make a Deal now on CBS?
I haven't seen that version.
Yeah, is that?
Oh, it
Boy,
is a black fellow though.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I let
Yeah.
me see if I can get his name quickly, because he is a great host, and he is great at what he does. He
And
was
we
a
should
great
mention Monty Hall, the original host, as one of
Yes,
the
Monty
icons.
Hall was brilliant on there, because Monty Hall was an oasis of sanity in a madhouse. That isn't easy to pull off either.
And you always thought you mentioned how a certain host you said was always on the side of the contestants. Monty Hall,
John Daly.
John Daly. Monty Hall always seemed to be like a used car salesman, always
Yes.
trying to trick the people.
He was. Wayne Brady. Wayne Brady is the host of Let's Make a Deal.
And Wayne Brady is also on a show called Whose Line Is It Anyway, where he does improvisations. And this is an odd game show where there's no prizes or anything. And is it really a game show? I mean, it's one of these odd shows that I've seen sometimes Saturday nights on CW, and I'm on my lunch hour in the evening at work. I'll watch that, and it's like, boy, that's a very interesting show. You know, they'll give you, here's a horn, here's a comb, and you're a man whose toupee is just fallen off, or something.
Yeah, the original British version of that is hilarious, because there the host actually did try to make at least a pretense that you had competition between the four celebrities, and he would often say, well, that was really very insightful. You'll get 18.5 points for that. Or if something didn't go well, he'd give them minus 100. But nobody ever kept score on that. But now that's neither fish nor fowl. And interestingly enough, of course, Drew Carey hosted the original American version of that too. And that suggests to me that having improv skills of one kind or another is really an invaluable trait for today's game show host to have, especially when you're talking about two shows like Let's Make a Deal and The Price is Right, where the participants are unpredictable, there's a lot of interaction with the audience, and you have to be ready for almost anything to happen. I never would have expected that Drew Carey would have become as big a star of The Price is Right as he has, but it seems in some ways as if this is the perfect role for him, and he has handled it adeptly. Wayne Brady, who's a tremendously talented young man, has handled that brilliantly, and I think that's something you need on a game show today, is the ability to be able to think on your feet and to adapt quickly and to come back either with the bon mots or to play the straight man.
Yeah, and but to return to my original question,
Hmm.
uh, it's odd because we live in what's now a very hip hop rap saturated culture. You know,
Yes.
all professional athletes, especially black athletes, and even white athletes like Travis Kelce, the new boyfriend who plays of Taylor Swift, who plays for the Kansas City Chiefs. They speak urban, if you want to call it, even though they
Yep.
were born on some Iowa farm. Uh, and yet here we have something that, on the face of it, seems 180 degrees from rap culture, which is game shows. They
Yep.
seem to. You would think most of black culture would look at that as corny, as white people stuff, and yet again, and I don't have the numbers, but I would bet that the dominant people that are keeping game shows alive are black and to a lesser extent Latino. So do you have any ideas why this is?
From a sociological standpoint, there are a couple of ideas, I suppose. If you're looking at a game show as the ability to win fabulous prizes, and that would be the case with a show like The Price is Right,
Mm.
I think, then there may be an appeal to that show for viewers who would not ordinarily have the opportunity to be able to shop for prizes in that to that degree, to that level. And I think that they may be able to live vicariously through that in a way that other income groups, other demographic groups might not be able to. There's also an element of competition that may appeal to them. There is possibly an element of the idea that this is their chance to get something that they feel has been denied to them in the past. I don't want to press that one too hard because I'm
Mm-hmm.
not, even though a lot of the work that I do and a lot of my writing has overtones of sociology to it, I'm not a sociologist, so I don't want to presume to have more knowledge in that field than what is limited to this kind of a topic. But I would assume that there is something to that they see this ability to be able to enter domains formerly they weren't allowed into or they weren't able to gain access to.
So let's turn towards the future. We are almost now a quarter of the way through the 21st century.
Mm.
Um, Game shows started, as you said, a little over 100 years ago on radio. Um, and I'm looking at the two big juggernauts right now, aside from Steve Harvey, are of course the evening shows of Wheel of Fortune, usually followed by Jeopardy, or sometimes vice versa.
Hmm.
And Jeopardy really blew, I thought, Alex Trebek's death a few years ago, where wanted they were going to make the host some behind the scenes guy who had some kind of video scandal or something. He was shooting his mouth off. Then they brought in Ken Jennings, who was the top winner ever on the show to host, and they got Mayim Bialik. And now, I think just a few months ago, I saw that Pat Sajak sort of gave his notice that he's only got one more season and he's going to go. And Vanna White, God love her, but she's not 30 anymore. She's
Hmm.
she's a little old lady or getting there. What do you think is the future of those two particular shows, and what do you think is the future of game shows, and how are they going to innovate as the century goes on?
Yeah.
Do you think?
I think it's going to be very interesting with those two game shows. They have, particularly Wheel, has a big job when you introduce a new host, no matter, and I've forgotten who the new host is going to be. But that's that for that person. It's going to be tough to follow in the footsteps of a legend. It always is, and so I would be cautiously optimistic about Wheel. Depends on if the new lineup is able to click with the public the same way Pat and Vanna have been able to do for so long, because the public is fickle. And we've already seen a little bit of that with some of the trouble with Jeopardy when Mayim Bialik was removed from the show, at least for the time being, and there has been some suggestion from her supporters and from some neutral observers that part of her removal was connected to her support for Israel in the current conflict in the Gulf. And then there was another cadre of Jeopardy fans who just didn't like her and didn't think she was a good host. There are people who like Ken Jennings because he's a Jeopardy legend. There are also quite a few people who don't like Ken Jennings. So anytime you come to a crossroads like this, it's going to be very interesting to see what will happen. And I would be cautiously optimistic about both of them, but I think you would be foolish not to say that the next 2 or 3 years are really going to tell. And if they do continue to be on TV, are they going to continue to be the kind of cultural and ratings juggernauts that they have been, or are they going to become even more of a niche than they have been? Is there something that's going to come along to replace them? Is there, whether it's a new game show or a new type of programming? As for the future of game shows, they're not going to go away as long as you have dedicated networks like Game Show Central and Game Show Network. I think, especially on the networks, you're going to see more of a hybrid type of a show that introduces elements of both traditional game shows and reality shows. There are people who consider Survivor to be a form of a game show, and I suppose that in the sense that there is competition involved, that's true. But you see a lot of these shows like The Weakest Link was an example of a game show, reality show type hybrid. You have other shows on there, Deal or No Deal, The Voice. Are they game shows? Are they variety shows? Are they reality shows? I think whatever the answer is, you're going to continue to see more of an evolution of that. The other thing that I think you will see is that if you're looking for more classic game shows, you're going to see them in the continuing reboots of the old shows that you see, where you've had, I think it's ABC who's had a little bit of success with the revived Pyramid and the revived version of Match Game. And they run as a very limited summer replacement series, and they have some success at that. You have College Bowl coming back again. The most recent version was hosted by Peyton Manning, whom I find an interesting choice to host a game show, but not, in my opinion, not a credible choice, but your mileage may vary. I think that when it comes to the networks, though, that's what you're probably going to see, are these hybrid versions or these reboots. And I think that the rest of the shows you're going to see continuing to come out on syndication or on the dedicated networks are going to be these more of the same, more that lean on the reality elements, that lean on the comedy elements, that lean on contestants being outrageous enough that they're really on there to become celebrities. And I think that's probably what the future holds. Even a game like Password I know Jimmy Fallon loves Password, and he's tried to recreate the original version of Password, but he can't resist turning it into a stand-up show or a vehicle for whoever it is who's going to be hosting or appearing on it. And often it even winds up with just all celebrity versions of some of these shows. Yeah. And that's really where the game is secondary, and the chance to get your one-liners off is the primary. It's like Hollywood Squares, except it's not as funny and it's not as clever, and it doesn't involve the ordinary contestants.
Final point, we should point out that Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy were Merv Griffin shows. He was another titan in there. And we talked about him, I think, on an earlier show when we did talk show host. But I think also, wasn't Concentration a game show by Griffin?
Might have been, or it might have been Merrill Quigley. I can't remember on that, but Merv started several game shows. I think he even had a TV version of Scrabble at one time that he tried out. But by far, Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune are the two that made him. And when he became a real estate mogul and all these other things, they were in large part behind his ability to be able to do that. So
Yeah.
he deserves a place in the game show Hall of Fame, along with Barry and Enright and Goodson-Todman. He certainly deserves a place. And Merrill Quigley, some of the other hosts, or some of the other producers from that time.
I think my own personal opinion is that I think Wheel of Fortune is going to suffer a lot. I think that's really an old folks show, whether they're white or black. Whereas Jeopardy is easy to renew. I think they did make a mistake with the having two hosts. I remember they were really pushing after the first guy had some scandal. LeVar Burton had a fan base where he was being pushed as the host of that.
Very popular choice. Aaron Rodgers was a very popular. He had his own fan base as well.
Yeah, but if you've seen his comments recently,
forget him. He's not. He did not pass into Final Jeopardy, or he entered Final Jeopardy. Maybe.
But I think LeVar Burton would have been a good choice, not only because he's smart, but because he's black. He's going to appeal to that demographic. Yep. So maybe there's another Steve Harvey out there that could revive Wheel of Fortune, but I don't know. But anyway, I want to thank you for another interesting show, and we'll be back within a month or two talking about more television, whatever we get.
One thing I want to give a small plug here to a lot of the research that I have done to back up my information on it. I got from this book. It's called Game Show FAQ, and it's by Adam Nedeff, who knows more, has forgotten more about game shows than I will ever know. But if you get a chance, it's a great book. Check it out. I would heartily endorse that. And that's one of my primary reference books on my shelf when I need to know something about a show, and that was invaluable on here. So thanks a lot. Thanks everybody, and looking forward to doing the next show.